raises lots of particular questions because Genesis has lots of descriptions of important things like a global flood, a creation week. It describes the initial fall of man and other things that are important for different parts of the Bible. So, what's this all about? So, depending on your background, there's not very many people from different backgrounds here, but depending on your background, there can be lots of different responses to Genesis. So, I think just about everyone here has a view that it's more literal. So maybe this is just something that you'll encounter in other people you talk to. Some people, when you describe Genesis or you talk about it, they just think it's a complete myth, that there's no God, that life evolved according to science, and Genesis was completely made up. Other people do believe in a God, but they think that Genesis is still completely mythical. They also believe in the literal evolution process as described in a standard biology textbook. And then there's a third position, which is a little bit more complicated, and that is that there is a God, and Genesis is God's description of creation, but it's very loosely historical. It's not meant to be taken literally, but it's a poetic rendition of the creation or evolution process, which is described more factually by science. So, people can fall in different points between some of these different positions too, but I think that the four descriptions here are fair for a complete description. Michael, did you turn the recording on? So what does the Bible say about the beginning of time? It's pretty explicit. I mean, it says the very first verse, the very first chapter says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then later in Exodus, this is a summary of what Genesis 1 and 2 say. It says, in 6 days, God made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them. So that's, very explicit. And then it goes on to justify, that's why the Jews were to rest on the Sabbath day. That's where the traditional week came from. So it's kind of awkward if you don't take that as 6 literal days, because then the justification gets strange. And then also it says, God formed man from the dust of the ground on the 6th day, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. That's kind of hard to reconcile with the idea that man, as a result of millions of years of evolution from reptiles to apes to eventually humans, since it describes a very different process here. So what else does Genesis claim? It claims that God created the world, including man, in 6 days. It claims that the world was perfect when it was created. The word says very good. And the rebellion of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 was what initiated all of the imperfection in the world that we see today. It also says there was a massive global flood where God destroyed the world in judgment, except for Noah and the people and animals on the ark with him. And if you take the genealogies that exist in Genesis 5 and 11 and you add up the dates and the ages, then you come to a conclusion that this must have happened less than 10,000 years ago, if those numbers are to be any good at all for anything. So some people say, well, of course, it's just a myth. I mean, that's just a creation myth. Every culture has had creation myths. But how does the Bible speak of itself? I mean, fundamentally, if you believe in a literal word of God, then the best way to understand the Bible is to let the Bible interpret itself as much as possible. So if you want to understand one passage better, you look at what that writer had to say in other places in his book. You look at what other writers in the Bible had to say about that writer's work. And so if we're looking for things about Genesis, there's plenty of different places throughout the Old and New Testament where the events of Genesis are referenced. Here's 3 of them. So Jesus says, the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. Until the day that Noah entered the ark, they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of man be. So Jesus compared the flood of Noah's day to his return, which is, of course, taken to be a real event. I mean, clearly the disciples understood it that way, and Jesus wanted them to. So why would he compare it to something mythical? Paul, in Romans 5, wrote, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all have sinned." So when Paul was talking about the origin of sin and our need for salvation, he tied it in with the fall described in Genesis 3, the sin of Adam, the original sin. And he says that death spread through all mankind because of that event. So he definitely takes it as a literal thing, very fundamental to his theology. And then we have Peter, who wrote, "When the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water." So Peter here is talking about the patience of God, God's character. Why would you justify God's character with an imaginary event? That's kind of troubling. So clearly the New Testament describes the Bible, in particular Genesis, as being literal. So, I mean, you could consider maybe the New Testament writers knew that Genesis was allegorical and wrote it that way anyway. And that would be confusing. That would be definitely misleading to the reader. Or maybe the New Testament writers thought Genesis was historical, but they were mistaken. And that's also troubling, because if the Bible is taken as the inspired word of God, it shouldn't have mistaken views in it. The New Testament writers might have known Genesis was historical, and it really is. That's the position I'm arguing for. Or perhaps the writings don't accurately preserve what they actually said. And that's hard to justify because we have an excellent database of manuscripts of ages that make them very close to the original. And so there can't have been very much change in the New Testament. In essence, I feel that the only satisfactory response to Genesis and the rest of the Bible as a whole is that you have to take it all or reject it. I mean, if you start taking it piecemeal, then you're not believing the Bible, you're believing yourself. So is that important? I mean, some people say, well, I mean, yeah, Genesis is kind of a problem, but I'm really focused on the gospel. That's what's important to me. I'm not going to worry about Genesis too much one way or another. But look at what Paul said. So going back to Romans 5, and I've extracted 2 verses from a fairly long passage that's kind of complicated. And so Paul says here, and I would recommend you go back and look at the whole thing. He says, "Therefore, just as though one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men, because all have sinned. For if by the transgression of one, death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ." So you see here, he's making this correlation. He says that through Adam's rebellion, the world and all of mankind entered into a state of sin, and that sin spread to all mankind. It also says, sin is the cause of which the effect is death. So sin produces death. And in other places it says sin, the wages of sin is death. On the other hand, you have Christ, who did the opposite of Adam. He obeyed instead of rebelled, which led to a state of righteousness, his righteousness, which then can spread through all mankind, just as the sin of Adam could spread through all mankind. And so the natural result of that righteousness is that it makes possible the gift of eternal life that Christ makes available to everyone. And so you see that the connection here, the whole gospel message is tied in symmetry to the fall in Genesis 3. Paul basically says death came from sin. Before sin, there was no death. Sin came from the actions of Adam. Redemption from sin comes from the action of Jesus. There's a symmetry and contrast there. So if the consequences of sin existed before Adam's fall, like evolution would say, then why would they not continue after Christ's rise? I mean, there's an argument here that the gospel changes the world, that it can change the world. in reverse of the way that the introduction of sin changed the world. But according to evolution, the introduction of sin did not really change the whole world in a noticeable way. So why would you assume that the gospel will? It's pretty fundamentally important. So let's look at what the details are. What does evolution say? Well, it says all life arose from single-celled organisms. Those spontaneously evolved in some primordial soup. Over billions of years, these organisms evolved into all the forms of life we see today. All life has competed for limited resources, and those most fit survived and replicated. This is the main driver for introducing more complex forms of life. It says life originated without any creator, gradually building up from nothing. I mean, some people disagree with that particular statement, say that evolution happened, but with the creator guiding it. Conventional evolution doesn't say such a thing, though. Evolved life originated at the expense of a pile of carcasses. You can't have natural selection without a lot of death. And that's the way it works. You kill off the weaker life in order for the stronger ones to survive and become even better. So, I mean, whether this is true or not is completely incompatible with God creating a perfect world and man bringing sin and death into it. If evolution is true, death existed long before man did, and the fall of man didn't really change the world that much, which is clearly contrary to what Paul describes. So I think the fundamental question boils down to this. You have science versus religion. I mean, this is, you see this phrased all the time, science versus religion. Are science and religion in conflict? Should science or religion be allowed to disprove the other one? I think, though, that, fundamentally the question boils down even further than this, though. If you are wanting to believe science and religion, you're like the man that Jesus described who can't serve two masters. He said, you'll either love one and hate the other, or cleave to one and despise the other. And that's the same thing here. You can't have two equal methods of finding truth. So truth is out there. And you have two methods here that we use to discern what the truth is, science and religion. So when they come in conflict, what do? How do you decide which one is the right? Should you let science overrule your faith? Should you let your faith overrule science? I mean, we know science is fallible to some extent, but it also has dramatically proven its reliability on many points. So where do you draw the line? Just how seriously do you take your commitment to religion and your commitment to science? Well, I mean, I think that this is important, and I think that fundamentally you have to choose one as superior to the other. And my view is that you take religion first. If science and religion are in conflict, I'm going to go with the Bible and reject the science. And I'll show you why. It's more complicated than you might think. It's not just a matter of having a closed mind. But part of the issue is evolution is also founded on a lot of religious ideas. You can't do science at all without religion. They're both part of philosophy. And so you have to have some things that you take as assumptions in order to make any kind of conclusions. So here's some of the assumptions that are common in standard evolutionary practice. Number one, our senses, ability to reason, experiences, and memories are reliable. You can't do science without that. They also assume nothing exists besides what our senses or instruments can detect. Not all evolutionists believe that, but it is the majority opinion. Uniformitarianism is reliable. If you don't know what that is, we'll get to it in a minute. The first cell originated without a creator. They also argue that real science must explain everything without using a creator. If you use a creator, you're not doing real science. They say complex life forms can form naturally from simple ones. Now, many people would say that's not an assumption, that's a proven fact. But let's look at the details. We'll do that when we come to this. I'm going to go through all of these in more detail. And then finally, the seventh one has two possibilities that are each used in different ways. Either the universe formed on its own at the Big Bang without a creator, or the universe is infinitely old and the Big Bang is some result of a natural process. Now, there's no data to support these things. These are not conclusions. These are the assumptions that you use in order to start your investigation. And people aren't even looking for proof of these things particularly. They're looking for what you can do with them. So let's talk about the first one here. The fact is that we can do science because we have reliable minds, senses, memories, etc. Should we believe what we can do? I mean, here's what Darwin said about it himself. I mean, he realized this was a problem. He said that if my mind has been developed from the mind of a lower animal, are of any value or at all trustworthy my opinions? Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind at all? So he realized, this is a problem for an atheistic view. Now, as a creationist, as someone who believes in God, I don't have such an issue with this because, of course, God created us in such a way that we're capable of comprehending him and his work. So I think that this is a good assumption from a creationist point of view, but I think it's a huge problem for someone who believes in evolution. Second assumption, the physical universe is all there is. So that assumption is called empiricism, and it's basically the idea that if you can't measure it, touch it, sense it in some way, then it doesn't exist. Anything that exists in a man is measurable. There is no such thing as a soul. In other words, that's not some balance of chemicals in the brain, and so on. So, to argue against that point, I'm going to show you some things about math, actually. So, an 1800s mathematician, German mathematician, made this statement: God made the integers, all else is the work of man. So what would somebody mean when they say God made the integers? Well, a similar idea came up recently in an article by the Smithsonian Magazine. This was published only 3 weeks ago. And I've tried to use a number of recent things and new things that you may not have seen before, just to kind of give some new relevance to this talk. So anyway, this article, we'll spend a couple of slides on it. They asked the question, what is math? And fundamentally, that's based off of a viral TikTok video that some teenager put up asking, why are we learning math? What is math? Who came up with this stuff? And so they asked, is math something that is discovered or something that is invented? The difference, of course, is that if you discover something, then it existed before you discovered it. Whereas if you invented something, you brought it into existence. So many scientists, such as Roger Penrose here, who won the Nobel Prize 2 weeks ago, says that math is discovered. He says, there appears to be some profound reality about these mathematical concepts going beyond the mental deliberations of any particular mathematician. It is as though human thought is instead being guided towards some external truth, a truth which has a reality of its own. So I think that's an intuitive position. I think obviously, math exists, whether you agree with it or not. It's not an invented thing. It's something that's always been there, always will be there, even if people don't know anything about it. So why would anybody contest that? Well, here's why. And this is still from the Smithsonian Magazine article. And it says, scientists tend to be empiricists. They imagine the universe to be made up of things we can touch and taste and so on, things we can learn about through observation and experiment. The idea of something existing outside of space and time makes empiricists nervous. It sounds embarrassingly like the way religious believers talk about God, and God was banished from respectable scientific discourse a long time ago. So that's a striking thing to say, don't you think? So they actually have a problem with math being something that exists outside of nature because it sounds religious. And they think that religion cannot be mixed with science. If there's anything that exists, it shouldn't be part of this religious made-up stuff. And he goes on to say, if the proof of the Pythagorean theorem exists outside of space and time, why not the golden rule or even the divinity of Jesus Christ? A very striking observation. So what happens if you assume that math must be invented, that everything real must be natural? Well, you get to ideas like this one from Carlo Rovelli, who's a famous physicist. He says that we came up with the geometry of flat space, the geometry of stuff in planes that everybody has to learn in high school, because we happen to live in a place that happens to be flat. He says if the Earth had been smaller, so that we saw the curves of it, we would have never invented Euclidean geometry. Instead, we would have developed spherical geometry, where you have stuff that exists on the surface of a ball. He even says then, only exists when you have stones, trees, people, individual countable things. He doesn't think that's even a fundamental concept, that there are integers, physical numbers of things like the concept of 2 + 2 = 4. He thinks that's invented, not rather than something that's fundamentally embedded in the universe itself. He argues that if intelligent creatures were found in the clouds of Jupiter's atmosphere, they might have no intuition for counting or for the natural numbers. And he uses that to argue that those things fundamentally don't exist outside of our imagination. I think that the strange nonsense of this is proof enough of how crazy it is to argue that the physical world is all there is. Math clearly does exist, despite what this physicist says. So I won't spend a lot of time arguing against it, because everyone knows, the world over, no matter what language or background you have, 2 + 2 = 4. We understand what the concept of integers is and flatness. It doesn't depend on whether or not we have a flat Earth. I mean, we have rough ground and we make flat tables. That's not got anything to do with it. Flatness is an intuitive concept. So let's take the third assumption. Uniformitarianism is reliable. So what is uniformitarianism? Here's a picture from the Wikipedia article, which you can read all about it if you want to know all the gritty details. But in essence, uniformitarianism is the idea that the natural laws and process operating that we can observe are the same everywhere and have always been the same. Sounds like a reasonable thing, right? I mean, you can't do some science unless you assume that things somewhere else or at some point in time are the same as they are now in terms of the physical laws that are active and stuff. But clearly it does have limits. So in geology, uniformitarianism is referred to as the present is the key to the past. So we see like the California plate is moving off into the Pacific Ocean, and they extrapolate backwards and forwards that it's always been moving at that rate in that direction, or at least for a very long time. So they use this to justify vast extrapolations of the current data. It's recognized now that Earth's history has a lot of slow, gradual processes, but it also has natural catastrophes that interrupt these processes and are quite different in nature. And Peter actually talks specifically about this when he said, in the last days, mockers will come, and they'll say, all things continue just as they did from the beginning of creation. So he's talking about that exact concept of things, going along in the same way all the time. And he says, no. He says, it escapes their notice that by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of the water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. But by his word, the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. So he addresses this, and he says, Noah's flood was a real event that interrupted the gradual, slow processes that are continuing now. And God will interrupt them again and destroy the world again in judgment too. So beware, things are not always going to just go on as they look like they're doing now. So that assumption doesn't hold. Assumption 4, this one is particularly critical for a lot of biology. So I have a biology textbook, this book in the picture here, Biology 3rd edition by Raven and Johnson. It's an old text. They're in the 11th edition now, I think, but I expect that the text is similar. My edition says this: in principle, there are three possibilities for the origin of life. Extraterrestrial origin, that's something like either aliens seeding life on Earth or coming on spores or something, some way of it getting here, not originating here on Earth. It could have been created by a divine being, or it could have arisen through evolution, natural processes. So then he says, in this book, we'll only deal with the third possibility. He says that's not necessarily because it's the correct one, but that we're limited in the scope of our inquiry to scientific matters. Of the three possibilities, only the third one permits testable hypotheses to be constructed and provides the only scientific explanation that could be potentially disproven by experiments, by obtaining and analyzing actual information. So you notice here that they conclude that life originated without a creator because that's the only assumption that they deem to be scientific. They say that any other possibility isn't doing real science, so naturally, that's the only one you can do. Ironically, if that's the only assumption that you're going to investigate, then naturally, you're not ever going to be able to quite disprove it because that would leave nothing left. So there's kind of a bit of hypocrisy here. Assumption 5. Real science must explain everything without alluding to a creator. So there's an excellent book here, Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer, and he discusses in great depth the fact that at the microbiological level, the stuff that exists in our cells, the DNA, RNA, and proteins, interact in a very complex way to create the cell structure, to define how all of the organization within the cells happen, how the cells interact with one another. Everything that happens in biology basically is governed by these chemicals. And they're very, very complex chemicals. Now we've been studying them now for about 70 years, and we understand some of how they work. And you know what we found? They function almost exactly like computer code. A very, very advanced computer code, much more advanced than any of the ones that we use on our computers. So, Meyer asked the question, if you find a bunch of computer code, would you assume that it had to have arisen on its own? Or would it be more reasonable to assume that someone designed it? Now let me point out, I can write computer code that has the ability to modify itself, that has the ability to evolve. We've done that. We know how to do that. But would you ever suppose that such a code could originate from scratch, just from random electrical currents in the computer? No, of course not. It's not a reasonable hypothesis. The only reason that it's given credence is because it's the only option that doesn't involve a creator. It's the only one that fits that assumption in the previous slide and in this one. So what about after the origin of life? Maybe you grant that there's evidence that the origin of life invoked some special creative process, an outside influence. But surely the fossil record has ample evidence of evolution since then, right? Well, actually, there's some severe problems in the fossil record with the evolutionary theory. So here's one of them. All of the phyla of animals, well, not all of them, but the majority of them all started appearing at the same fossil layer, in the Cambrian layer. At the Precambrian level, there's just a bit of fossil evidence, as you see here, for different kinds of animals. And then all of a sudden in the Cambrian layer, you get this explosion of all sorts of very different kinds of animals. And then a few of them are only seen in more recent layers, such as humans, of course. But how does evolution explain this sudden emergence of all of these? Well, if you look at the scientific work by evolutionists, they'll kind of say, well, yeah, we used to use that word explosion, but it really took place over 50 million years, so it's not credible to call it an explosion. Here's the thing, though. If you look at the whole fossil record in the span of time that it's supposed to cover, which is about 3 billion years, then a 50 million year period is indeed extremely small. And there was a whole lot of evolution that must have happened in that period. So it does qualify as an explosion. So, how could it have evolved that fast? Another issue is if you start looking at the details of how DNA modifies itself, the beneficial mutations you need to get more complex life forms don't happen fast enough. And not only do they not happen fast enough, they have to not only, you don't have to have more than one creature that has this beneficial mutation. You have to get it to penetrate through the whole species so that it becomes part of the whole species genome. And that takes several generations, And if you don't have natural selection strongly favoring the ones that have this gene, then it may never happen at all. And if it does, it's going to be very slow. What's more, harmful genetic mutations are far more common than beneficial ones. And we see even today, genetic diseases are quite common in both animals and mankind. And so my view is, and this is confirmed by some computer simulations, that if you just simulated the mutation process, in the end you get to the point where none of the species were viable at all, not to where the most beneficial were favored over everything else. And so everything would go extinct over billions of years. Another complication in the mutation aspect is the idea of irreducible complexity. So the problem is, most of the time, to get the remarkable things that we see in different levels, like the bombardier beetle or the Bacterius flagellum, you can't do that with one mutation. You can't do it with two or even half a dozen. You need hundreds of mutations to get such a complex, effective process. And if you take out one piece of it, then the whole thing does not confer a selection advantage. So you have to have all the pieces at once to get an advantage. The same is true of the human eye, for example. So most biologists argue, well, it actually came from simpler mechanisms that were somewhat similar, or maybe mechanisms that convert advantage in a different area, and then it evolved and produced this. They make some good arguments, but there's some problems with them. One is you still have to have several mutations at once in order to get any selection advantage at all. And two is the process that they're advocating takes far too long. Statistically, there's just simply not enough time to produce this stuff, especially when you see the limitations that the fossil record puts on when these creatures must have originated. So, I'm sure you've heard the expression, if you give 1 million monkeys typewriters and an infinite supply of bananas and assume that the monkeys are immortal, then eventually they would bang out the complete works of William Shakespeare. Now, in practice, they would bang out a whole bunch of junk first, and it would take an obscene amount of time for them to actually produce anything of value, let alone the complete works of William Shakespeare. But the fossil record puts time limits on how much time you have to create the life forms we see today, and there's just simply not enough time statistically to do this way. Besides for the fact that it all looks like code that was encoded this way on purpose. So then if you look at the fossil record, what it actually shows is that there's not this gradual transition from one kind of animal to another one, from ancestors of apes and man to the forms that we see today. In fact, almost all the fossils look very similar to either extinct animals or to current animals and mankind. There's not anything that's 50-50. Evolutionists have been aware of this problem, and many of them have even fabricated or mislabeled fossils in order to try to give more credence to the idea that man evolved. And here's just 3 examples. of things that turned out to be fake discoveries. There's the Neanderthal, which is now well known to be quite as advanced as modern man. The Piltdown man, which was simply a modern monkey. And then the other one here that was actually a type of extinct orangutan and was claimed as a transitional form. There's others that have turned out to be identical to pygmy humans, or the Aborigines of Australia that were called transitional forms, even though they looked exactly like them. And it's just ridiculous. I mean, there's even one that turned out to be a pig tooth. So the fossil record does not do a good job of supporting evolutionary theory, despite what a lot of the experts argue. Let's go to cosmology, the study of the universe. So evolutionists assume that the universe formed on its own, or that it is infinitely old and then the Big Bang happened as a result of some natural process we can't observe. Now, if we can't observe it, then it's clearly an assumption. If the universe formed on its own, that causes some strange problems, and there's definitely not data to support it, so it's clearly an assumption. So I have a quote here from a textbook by Landau and Lifshitz, which is considered one of the best physics textbooks by some of the foremost physicists. And they say, if we attempt to apply statistical physics to the entire universe, we immediately encounter a glaring contradiction between theory and experiment. According to the results of statistics, the universe ought to be in a state of complete statistical equilibrium. However, and I'll kind of reword this for time's sake, the properties of nature bear no resemblance to those of an equilibrium system. Astronomical results show that the same is true throughout all the universe. So the problem here is, if you assume that the universe is infinitely old, or at least old enough to have relaxed by now, then it ought to be in equilibrium. And this is basically the idea. If you take a frozen bottle of water and you put it in a boiling pot, then after 5 minutes, the water ought to be all close to the same temperature. If you see ice still in the boiling water, you know that it had to have been put there recently. That's what they have a problem with, is that the universe as a whole demonstrates that it happened recently, and that it started in a highly ordered state, a state that is not natural. So they go on and they say, we might try to overcome this contradiction by supposing that the part of the universe that we observe is just some huge fluctuation in a system that is in equilibrium as a whole. The fact that we've been able to observe this huge fluctuation might be explained by supposing that for such a fluctuation to exist, then, and to be observed, then you have to have an observer. So it's, it just kind of, we couldn't observe it unless it really happened. So that's why we can observe it. However, they point out that it'd be far easier to create a single solar system that was out of equilibrium than all of the observable universe. And then they go on and they say that gravity is exempt from the claim of the second law of thermodynamics, the claim that everything has to tend toward equilibrium. I've not seen any other scientists make this argument because it has no support and it's fundamentally flawed. So it's rather shocking that a Nobel Prize winning physicist would argue such a thing. But that just shows you how desperate people are to validate their assumptions, in this case that the universe is infinitely old. It comes down, as a lot of problems in cosmology do, to this thought process called the Boltzmann brain. Now, Boltzmann here was a founder of the science of thermodynamics, which is the study of systems in equilibrium or out of equilibrium, the flow of heat and things like that. And so people have been thinking about the origin of the universe for a long time from a scientific point of view. And they had the issue that if you come up with an idea in cosmology that is less likely than for a single brain to spontaneously and briefly form in a void complete with false memories of having existed and everything about our universe, if that's more likely than it is for our universe to have originated with your theory of cosmology, then your theory of cosmology is garbage, basically. This problem actually plagues many of the current models for how the universe came to be. So that's something you won't hear every day. But as you see, there is a Wikipedia article on it, so you can read all about it. And even foremost cosmologists admit this is a serious problem. So where does the issue come from? It basically comes from the second law of thermodynamics. Now this is related to Murphy's law in a way. The second law of thermodynamics says that this total entropy of an isolated system can never decrease over time. Okay? Now entropy is basically disorder, like you see in the two pictures here. So this can explain why things generally tend toward a more disordered state over time. Systems that have external influence are partially exempt. For example, your room gets more ordered when you clean it up because you are influencing it. Trees can grow and get more complex, less disordered, by absorbing energy from the sun. But still, you see that the exemptions are very narrow and specific to design things that can incorporate the disorder and do things with it in a certain way while consuming energy. So the second law of thermodynamics has been plaguing cosmology, and the Boltzmann brain has been plaguing cosmology forever. And the current state of it is pretty bad. Many scientists are claiming that the Big Bang occurred in a larger multiverse, which just kind of spawns new universes over time. This theory has no evidence, and you couldn't possibly make evidence for it, I don't think. Because anything that you called evidence for it could be explained half a dozen other ways, which you could argue are more likely. So that doesn't really mean evidence. Others persist in arguing that the Big Bang could originate spontaneously from nothing. This is less likely than the Boltzmann brain, so it fails that test. And it also has an issue called the fine-tuning problem, which is that all the constants in nature today, like the charge of the electron, the charge of the proton, the masses of the fundamental elements, all those things, if they didn't have their exact value to something like 16 decimal places, I think even more than that, then the atoms that we have today, especially the complex chemicals on which life depends, could not exist. They wouldn't be stable. They just blow up. So these things look designed. They look fine-tuned and adjusted to make life possible. So that gets to be a big problem. And then you also have the idea, this is Stephen Hawking's idea, that time started existence when the Big Bang happened. So asking what caused it or how it started is meaningless because there was no time when it didn't happen. It was, you can't ask what caused the beginning of time. I think that argument is cheating. Of course you can ask what caused it. It has to be something eternal, something outside of time. But how can you say that cause and effect itself came into existence without having something to cause it? I think that's crazy. That's my view. You can have your own. So basically, looking through all those 7 assumptions, we saw the first one, I think, is necessary to get any further. And I think it's well justified by viewing a God, but some of the others are very faulty, and some of them rest on very flawed views and reasoning. Others are not well supported by the data. But we saw that science versus religion really isn't such a problem after all. Science, when you dig into it further, shows itself to not be super reliable. So I have no problem at all with saying that some of the scientific evidence I'm not going to agree with, and others I'm not going to agree with the conclusions because they had bad assumptions. And instead I'm going to agree completely with the Bible. Now, in particular, this idea that you can't do science if you invoke a creator. I think that is particularly ridiculous since many of the founders of our current scientists were explicit creationists, including, for example, Isaac Newton, who founded the discipline of physics. I mean, there's no science that's more successful than physics. And the very guy that invented most of it is the most influential physicist of all time, was an explicit Christian and believed that it all was created by God. So evolution now is not just a scientific theory. It has a lot of science in it, but it's allowed to continue despite contradictory evidence because any alternate view is ruled out as non-science. And so it's really a religion, because that's the way religions work, is you have faith tenets that are irrevocable. So you have two religions that are both arguing over the data. Remember, science is only as good as its data and the logic getting from the data to the conclusions. It doesn't matter how many experts say one thing or another. What matters is what the data says. So this is a conflict over what the data says. And I say that it does not support evolution well. How do you prove evolution? How do you disprove it? It can't be disproven if you don't allow anything other than evolution. That would be, it's a circular argument. If you only allow a natural means for life to originate, then naturally, that's all you can get. If the universe is forced to have come into its current state without any creator, then you have to try to come up with a natural evolutionary type of approach to describe it. I mean, if you insist that the fossil record has to show a family tree, and you don't really care that several different kinds of animals all showed up at once, then, I mean, basically they're just ignoring the data they don't like, twisting it to fit the theories, twisting the theories to fit the data. It's not really doing science, because no alternatives are allowed. You can't prove and disprove things if there's only one possibility. So why is science consider evolution to be the only acceptable theory? Well, a lot of it comes down to those two assumptions that are not founded on good science or philosophy. They're just assumptions that people like and won't give up. One is that people are unwilling to admit anything that is not physical exists. And the reason for that is that they want their science to be able to be applied to everything. They don't want anything to exist where you can't operate on it with science. Math, God, religion, they think those things have to be made up, invented, not fundamentally real and outside of physical creation, because they can't be measured. And of course, the other one is that people still think that any theory invoking a creator represents a failure to do real science. It represents giving up, basically. So, I mean, of course, that's the only thing you can have if you're going to think about science that way, and that's nonsense. Another problem that's very common in our culture today is that science is placed on a pedestal where it's considered to be perfect. I mean, just look at all of our political leaders and how they keep talking about following the science and so forth and so on. And then you go and look at what the scientists say, and they all are arguing with each other. I mean, scientific method is not perfect. The scientific method is designed in such a way that you're going to be wrong most of the time. It's designed to get iteratively less wrong over time as you accumulate more data. Most scientific theories in every field are wrong to some extent. Some of them are very wrong, like our current popular interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's absurd. And so besides for the fact that evolution, people pretend like it can have no fault, and science as a whole can have no fault, even though it clearly does, and I say that as a scientist, then besides for that, evidence against evolution has been actively suppressed. We have journals that won't publish papers showing design processes in nature. We have parks that have denied creation geologists' ability to collect data and to work on their theories in those parks and things like that, just because people want evolution to be the only allowed theory. And that's not the scientific method. You're supposed to have competing theories so that you get the best one. So one last thing on the theory of evolution before I move on. I keep hearing evolution is as established as the law of gravity. People talk about what the scientific method is, and they say that evolution is like the law of gravity. It's undeniable. Well, obviously those people aren't very scientifically literate because gravity is very poorly understood at a fundamental level. We don't know how gravity works inside the nucleus of every atom. We don't know how it works in black holes. We don't know how to reconcile it with quantum mechanics. We don't know why most astronomical objects appear to have too much gravitational attraction. They're moving toward each other too quickly. What people actually mean is not that it's as established as the law of gravity. What they mean is that it's as much a fact as that things fall down. Obviously, this is nonsense because gravity, in that very simple way, can be tested, repeated, observed as much as you like. Evolution cannot because it occurs over a very long period of time. So this whole argument is just silly. One last quote on this. I love this. Evolutionists have physics envy. They tell the public that the science behind evolution is the same science that sent people to the moon and cures diseases. It's not. The science behind evolution is not empirical, but forensic. No testing, no observation, no repeatability, no falsification. I think this is what the public discerns, that evolution is just a bunch of just so stories disguised as a legitimate science. So that's pretty down-putting. But it's true. I mean, science is only as good as the experiments that can disprove it, and evolutionists have none. So what about observed evolution? I mean, we've seen some things. We've seen like the variation in the finches and the Galapagos Islands, their beak sizes change. We saw the moths change colors in the Industrial Revolution and then changed back. We see now, even now in humans, that there's a third artery that's becoming more common, going through the wrist. I don't contest that those things happen. Small variations, many of which favor natural selection. Of course, that's the way things are designed to happen. What I contest is that these things do not lead over time to producing entirely new kinds of life, that they can't get over the barrier of irreducible complexity, basically. So if you shift then, and you say, okay, well, let's reject evolution and start over. Is there evidence of a creator? Is there good evidence? Is it any better than the evidence for evolution? Well, there is the sudden evidence of life forms showing up all at once in the fossil record. There's the complex coding in all life forms' DNA. There's the complex machinery, that the mechanisms inside all animals that allow them to function. I mean, look at the way all your organs work together. It's amazing. There's the undeniable fact that the universe had a beginning. There's the fact that everything is getting more disordered and decayed, which means it must have been very ordered to begin with. And then finally, math itself shows us that the concept of perfection is real. Where did that concept come from? It doesn't exist in our physical world, clearly, and yet we know what it is. How's that? So which mode of operation is better? Using a philosophy that science must only look for natural and local means to explain all events, or a paradigm that science should seek the most consistent and reasonable explanation for all the data? I'm going to go with number 2. So if you tried the hypothesis that the creator is real, would you find sufficient evidence to disprove it, or maybe evidence to validate it? Well, I challenge you to do so if you're not doing so already. So here's my approach. I have a different set of assumptions from those of a traditional evolutionist, and here's how they go. I think that truth is more important than the scientific method. What that means is, if I feel that the scientific method is forcing me to go away from what the data actually says, my scientific method needs to be improved. I don't need to reject an idea because it's, quote, not science. Let's reject it because the data says it's not reliable, not because it's not science. I think that God inspired the writing of the Bible to be clear and reliable because, in my view, God is a person that wants us to understand him. He wants us to understand the world. So he created my mind and the world itself in a way that they can be understood. I mean, clearly science works. So that's evidence of that, I think. And finally, I think God wants to be found. He's not hiding. And so using this approach, I've been successful as a scientist, and I think it's completely consistent with the scientific method. So why do I believe what I do? Well, fundamentally, the most important thing is I know the God of the Bible. He's revealed himself to me personally, and his revelation to me, his book, the Bible, and the creation have all been consistent with each other. So because they all agree with each other, I have a very firm conviction of what I believe. So what are you going to take away from this? Here's the points I hope that you get out of this. 1, science doesn't rule out or disprove God. The absence of God in science is the result of a bad assumption, not anything that's been proven. And they started with that assumption in there and forced everything that was concluded to hold to it. It's not any kind of conclusion. You can be a good scientist and a good Christian, which means you can follow the scientific method, you can accept data, you can study things well, and you can also believe the Bible. You can not try to avoid the difficult passages in the Bible and things like that. You can do a good job of both of those at the same time. I hope that you take away that the evidence supports a designer over a natural origin, and that God does want to be found. So, I mean, if you think about it, what could be more important in life than finding out if there is a God? And if so, what is he like? What is his agenda? I mean, I can't think of anything more important than in the universe. So if you're not doing that already, I would challenge you to make it a part of your life to be seeking God, because I think the evidence is excellent that he is out there. So with that, I'm going to stop and ask if anyone has any questions. All right, so if you're using the chat, I can't see it. So Michael will have to relay any questions you have from there.
I just made it where people could unmute themselves.
All right.
Hey, Dr. Barrett.
Hey.
How's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing fantastic. I really enjoyed your presentation. That was very thorough and thought-provoking, and I don't necessarily agree with all of the details in between, but I think the takeaways in the end that's something that I absolutely agree with. Would you
that's
go
what
back?
I want. I mean, people are going to have different opinions.
Definitely.
That's the way it should be.
Would you go back to that your takeaways page? There's one thing in particular that, I think the science ruling out or disproving God, I think I think atheism is just kind of lazy. I don't see why you necessarily, so if you disagree with some fundamental religions, right, and there's a lot of them, there's a lot of different religions in the world, and I think people will disagree with those and I think it's almost a lazy turn to say, well, then there's no God. But I think that that's super lazy. I think, to me, science, the study of the cosmos and the natural world and thermodynamics and mechanics, I think that is the search for God. And it always has been. To me, I can't imagine any greater purpose, right? Those are the questions that we've been asking for millennia. Are the questions of the nature of God. So I really couldn't agree more with your final takeaways. And I think it was just a great presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks, John. It's really ironic that many of the evolutionists argue that the creationist position is fundamentally lazy, that, saying that a designer did it that way shuts down inquiry, which is not the case at all. I mean, you can still ask, why did he make it that way? I mean, it's the same sorts of questions you get with a natural origin or a created one. So I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, and I agree with that point too.
All right, Dr. Barrett, we have a question from Jose in the chat.
Okay.
It seems to me that evolution theory is heavily sustained by multiple assumptions. In comparison, and if assumptions were to be weighted, which side would you consider takes more work to believe in?
Okay, so read it to me again, Michael. I want to make sure I got all of it.
It seems to me that evolution theory is heavily sustained by multiple assumptions. In comparison, and if the assumptions were to be weighted, which side would you consider takes more work to believe in?
Okay, that's a great question. So, I listed two different sets of assumptions, mine and then the traditional evolution ones. And yeah, my view is heavily dependent on these. And, maybe I come up with some data that might make it hard to believe some of these. Like there's parts of the Bible that are difficult to reconcile with each other, which would make it difficult to understand too. Then if you go back though to the list for evolution, so I'm going to go way back here and look at that list again. Okay. Some of these I find completely unsustainable, particularly 4 and 5. I think that those are so bad that it basically ruins the whole thing. So I would weight those so heavily that it would invalidate the whole process, because if you're forcing yourself to only allow one type of theory, then naturally that's the only kind of theory you can get. And I don't think that's sustainable with the evidence, because clearly we have code, and you can't. I mean, you could say that monkeys can bang out code on a calculator. We used that analogy before, but it's not likely compared to a designer. So individually weighting all of these, I haven't got numbers for all of them, but personally, I think 4 and 5 on this list kill the whole thing.
I have a question for you, Dr. Barrett.
All right.
We have discovered a couple of moons in our solar system, something that we could potentially, in the short term, investigate more closely with robotics. I'm specifically thinking about Europa and Saturn's moon Enceladus, which both have water in multiple states. There's ice water and liquid water that we've observed in these moons. And probably from tectonic forces, you've got some geothermal warming taking place.
Right.
And we have found life at the depths of our oceans in environments that we would have thought previously were totally inhospitable.
Right.
So it's possible that some of these locations on Europa or Enceladus, it's possible that they could have life. And really my question to you is a hypothetical. How would it affect your belief structure for creation? And I'm not picking one over the other here. If we sent robotic investigators and they found life, microscopic, of any sort, any kind of life.
So, in my view, the description in Genesis does not preclude life elsewhere. There's nothing that says that life is only on Earth in the Bible. So, I don't think it would be any kind of problem for my belief structure to find life elsewhere. Now, looking at it from the evolutionary view, I find it surprising that they think it's so likely to find life elsewhere, because you look at how implausible the process must have been in the first place. Why are they assuming that everywhere you have warm water that you can get new kinds of life just spontaneously? It's strange. So
yeah, I agree with that. That Genesis does not preclude the existence of life elsewhere. So I agree with that.
All right, what else? All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll reiterate that we're going to try to do this roughly once a month. We'll have one more in the fall semester in November, and then we'll have talks in the spring. So if you're interested in finding out about those and joining those, here's Naya's contact information at the bottom here. You can email her to get on the email list, or you can put your email in the chat and get in that way. So y'all have a great evening. I'm going to let y'all go now.
Thanks, Dr. Barrett. Have a good night.
Good night. Actually, I guess Michael